Jamie Cattell, welcome to the Tech for Non-Techies podcast. I'm so happy that you're here.
So, Sophia, it's really good to be here. So happy to be here on this bright and beautiful and somewhat hot New York morning.
Well, thank you so much. So I just saw your LinkedIn post that you are moving house in New York. And from what I understand, you're actually having some trouble with AI getting in your way. Can you tell us about what's driving you crazy about moving house today?
No, absolutely. So I've been a law customer, and I obviously won't mention the names of the companies just to protect the innocent, but been a law customer of this broadband company for 5 years, moving house, and unfortunately it became very complicated. And once you get then stuck in a chatbot, in this case, it becomes a little bit like trying to get out of an escape room sometimes. But between the chatbots and also between the agents, it seemed impossible after many hours on the phone to actually resolve my very simple problem of, can I actually get connected to the broadband? So I'm now in the process of changing providers. But I think experiences like this, when you look at what's happening underneath, provide so many interesting examples for how AI is changing and influencing our life, but also what companies can do much better to presumably retain their customers, which must be a critical corporate objective, yet so much opportunity to improve that. And that's what I'm excited about, actually, by the whole experience.
And I think this is really resonant, with a lot of people, is that in a way we know that we're living in this really fast moving technological age where, there's generative AI, going to Mars, all of this exciting stuff. But then on the other hand, there is this chatbot that is just idiotic and is completely like ruining your day. And there is nothing you can do despite your computer science degrees, everything that you've learned. Like, no, this little thing is going to hold you hostage and you're basically just a victim. And so why are we living in this world which is simultaneously kind of moving so fast? And we've got DeepMind and OpenAI, and on the other hand we have these very large rich companies torturing us with their chatbots. What's happening?
So that's a really good question, and something which I'm I think I need to dive much deeper into. But at one level, and to give you an example from yesterday, the chatbot was unable to determine the answer yes or no in a 2-option answer, which clearly
it wasn't even binary code. It wasn't even zeros or ones. It couldn't even get that.
So I know that technology, and we all know that technology is advanced beyond that, right? So the question is, why is a Fortune 50 company unable to do a very basic implementation of a chatbot? I think that's a very interesting question that will certainly need to be answered. But I think it comes down to AI. I'm an optimist. I have a background in AI that goes back more than 30 years to my chemistry background, actually applying that to looking at how molecules will be created. We're now starting to see those techniques come into fruition in the pharmaceutical and materials industry, which is hugely exciting. But I think it really comes down to impact in the end, right? Is this technology deployed in a way that makes a difference to something that matters at a scale that matters, right? And if it's not, it'll be at best a curiosity. At worst, it'll be a prison for an unsuspecting customer like myself. So I think that's the root cause of where we are. And as I think about how we address that as companies, how we address that as society, the first thing is to really just be focusing on the fundamentals. AI offers huge problem-solving opportunities and capabilities, but if we don't deploy those to the problems that matter, then we'll kind of just end up again repeating this kind of broken loop that we've been stuck in, just like my broken loop with the chatbot.
So tell us a little bit about your background. So you're working at IBM now. So could you tell us what you're doing there, and also what led you up to what you're doing today?
No, absolutely. So I work at IBM. I'm actually in the IBM office at the moment, and I lead our global strategy group. Before that, I was actually working in McKinsey. So I'm a strat as well as being a technologist. And at IBM, I really work to help our customers and our clients think through, yeah, how will we apply technology impactfully, right? And I'm obviously interested in technology. In fact, I love technology, but I only really care about it when I can see that it really brings impact to people's lives, to people's businesses, and that's really what I help our clients to do at IBM. So I'm obviously, for the purpose of this of meeting today, I'm going to talk about my own personal views. So I'm not representing IBM, but obviously that's based on that depth of experience in the last 30 years of really impactfully applying technology to business and society's problems.
So right now there is this hype about AI, which I've also had I've had some comments from AI developers who are very disappointed because they're saying, oh, this isn't new. AI has been around since the 1960s. It's just PR departments. What do you make of that? Why is there this hype right now when AI isn't really a new thing?
So if you sort of go back, and my history in AI goes back to the early 90s. But even then, I mean, some of the, as you say, the research and the algorithms that underpin this are several decades older than that. So, I mean, I was working on neural networks and I was working on genetic algorithms, which are in a sense, sort of unsupervised machine learning algorithms way back in the 90s, right? So, I kind of look at this and I just think we've been progressing. We've been doing some amazing engineering. We've got, reams and reams of data, right? And, I guess our, so we have been progressing. But the way that I think about this, someone's often said, we're trying to get to the moon, right? Especially when you think of, generalized intelligence, right? But we're building a very big ladder, right, to get there. And we know that it's impossible to basically get to the moon using a ladder, right? It may actually be physically possible. Who knows? After all, they are talking about making
Elon Musk might try it. God knows.
It may actually be possible. I usually like to say that anything that's possible within the laws of physics is possible, but we don't even understand those. So in theory, anything might be possible, right? But certainly I would say I can just see this big long progression, right? And if I would look at the current field of machine learning, right, it's essentially a stochastic process, i.e., driven by a set of probabilities, rather than a deterministic process. In full disclosure, I'm a bit of a deterministic guy because I'm a scientist. I like to have a theory. I like to have something that you can prove. I like to have an equation. That gives me, a good sense of certainty. And it worries me as a scientist that you could build a perfectly well-functioning AI model that could have density being negative. And generally speaking, we know that density probably can't be negative unless you're talking about antimatter, right?
Like
so
a black
density
hole.
can't really be negative, like a black hole, right? Density, and I don't even know if you can really have negative density, but you could have a perfectly well-working AI model where the coefficient of density could be negative, right? And I would say that could work very well for you empirically until it wouldn't work. And the problem is you wouldn't know when it wouldn't work, right? So you wouldn't be able to predict that when it would happen. It would, and it might happen in 1,000 years. It might happen in the next 10 minutes, right?
So am I right that you're saying that essentially AI models, they're essentially maybe kind of almost too mathematical? The theory works as an algorithm, but in practice you can't have minus density. So like, why does that happen?
So that happens, and again, I'm not the deepest technical person on this, right? So I'll give you my
I mean, it's called Tech for Non-Techies here, so none of us are.
I will give you my slightly, hands dirty, layman's business person's perspective on it. But in essence, when these models are built, you are populating, I guess, what are called model weights, but you kind of have a model that's often decided by the algorithm. And these model weights are kind of basically tweaked, right? And some of them could correspond, in this case, let's say, to density, right? You predict some outcome of a material. And it could just be that the best fitting algorithm, has a coefficient of density being negative. And that could kind of work quite well empirically as a model. It could work perfectly well. Because in essence, what the algorithm is doing is it's sort of fitting. It's fitting its sort of model view of the world to what it infers as reality in the data. right? And you know, but all it's doing is kind of playing around with these weights till it finds something that kind of fits quite well. And obviously, it's a very multi-dimensional model. You've seen now, obviously, with the famous GPT models, right? That they have, you know, trillions of parameters on that. And you know, the model that I built in the 90s was a 72 parameter model, right? 72, right? So you know, once you have trillions of parameters of models, it's virtually impossible to explain or understand what's going on. You just know, and you know, to make it a simpler problem, like face recognition, right? We don't understand how we can recognize faces. We just know that we do. So at one level, you could say, also a computer doesn't understand why it recognizes faces. We just know that it does, and it picks a set of points on the face that enable it to actually recognize that. So you could say, yeah, human cognition and computer cognition, there's a black box element to it, right? That we probably have to accept. But that, I think, comes into more difficulties, especially, you know, when there are kind of real answers to things. And being a pilot, I've actually been testing, you know, some of the.
You're a pilot too.
I'm a pilot, yes.
Okay, and what sort of things? I mean, if you're a pilot, I'm assuming you can't just fly everything. Or can you fly? I
wish I could,
not
but
know
no, you
anything
can't.
about this.
So I fly propeller, single engine land planes. So like think about a small Cessna, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so you can't get me across the Atlantic for when I get for when I need to get back to New York.
It's possible, but it would take too long and be too uncomfortable. So
okay, no, we don't want that.
Yeah.
Okay, so as a pilot, you were saying.
So as a pilot, I am, you know, used to testing a whole bunch of things and working with automation. And actually, one of the things I like to get into as well, very deeply, is to understand aerodynamics. And there's something called the lift equation, which basically is the equation for how much lift a wing will generate. And I was trying to understand that. And basically, the lift generated by a wing is proportional to the square of the velocity or the square of the airspeed. Right? And I thought, that's interesting. I didn't have an intuition as to why that would be true. And you probably have to go back and derive the equation to understand that. So I thought, well, ChatGPT is brilliant for kind of understanding things like that. So I said, okay, like, tell me, why is this true? Why is can you give an explanation for why it's the square of the velocity? It gave me a somewhat generic explanation for how lift is created in a wing, but it didn't understand the intent of my question. And through several attempts at redirection, was not particularly helpful at helping me. Although, of course, because it's so eloquent, the answers were very persuasive. So if you didn't know the field, you would be hoodwinked into, and we've seen obviously with the famous example with the lawyer, right? Of how eloquent these answers are, that they can take you down a path. And one of the things that I've written about quite a bit is that to use any technology, and when you get your pilot's license, to get your license, you have to understand how the airplane works, right? And you're tested on that, right? Because I guess if you're in the air, it's a good thing, and something happens, it's a good thing to know how it works.
Yes,
right?
Especially if you have passengers.
Especially when you have passengers, right? So I kind of think with the same with any technology we use, right? It depends what's at stake as well with the technology. And obviously, with an airplane, you're betting your life on this, right? So you better, at least, as I say, there are old pilots and bold pilots, but there are no old bold pilots, right? For a reason. So I think, again, in the case of the lawyer, for example, I think understanding the technology, what its limitations are, what it can do. If you don't understand what's under the hood, that could lead you into a whole world of pain. If all you're doing is, translating restaurant reviews, there's not a lot at stake there. You might get a bad burger at worst, right? There's not much at stake there. I'm kind of fine for that. But when I hear some of the use cases that start to get into pretty critical decisions in people's lives or people's health, or
Mm-hmm.
obviously automated driving has been one of these
Mm-hmm.
quests that supposedly $100 billion has been poured into, and we're still struggling to really kind of make that last mile
Mm-hmm.
of that work. And I wonder if we ever will do it. It'd be interesting to see how that actually pans out now. It seems to be perpetually 10 years ahead of us, right?
Well, so my question is then, let's take this pilot analogy, because you and I, we fly all the time, as do our listeners, and most of us do not know how to fly a plane or how it operates, and we probably kind of did, studied a little bit of this when we were at high school, and pretty much that's it. But because it's such a kind of ubiquitous thing now, that generally you get on the flight, you switch on the movie, have a glass of champagne, in my case, and you kind of don't really think about it. So what are you suggesting a normal kind of business leader should expect of themselves to learn about AI? Because if we are using this stuff, and if our organizations are using this stuff, and for investing in these things, yes, we do need to understand something, but also to what level?
It depends what is at stake. And I would also say that it's also probably not qualitatively different for any other factor that could actually blow your business up. So, again, by the way, just to reflect on how safe aviation is, I think I understand the current stats of aviation safety, at least commercial aviation. You'd have to fly every day for 800 years till you would have the chance of being involved in an accident. So those are pretty good odds for being in a commercial airplane. I think you can definitely sit back and relax and drink your champagne without any worry. So really the question in my mind is, can AI, does it have the potential to blow your company up? Either because you're exposing it to risks, which could be around, let's say, lawsuits, because you may have some exposure through some infringement of IP or something like that. I mean, you're seeing now all the artists suing the generative AI companies, although it looks like they're struggling at the moment in terms of finding whether that was really infringement on their work or not. So that's got to play out and see how that legal strategy happens. But that's clearly one area.
Actually,
obviously, reputation.
that was that point was a huge topic of conversation at the Cannes Lions Festival of Creativity, which is the big advertising festival, because first, there was this hype that creatives can actually use all this stuff, that can. But first there was the fear that, oh my God, AI is going to make all the creative campaigns and all of our jobs will be gone. Then it was like, okay, no, it won't, but it can be really helpful. And then the lawyers came in and basically said, no, we can't really use it because Taylor Swift is going to sue us, or Taylor Swift, or somebody else very good. And so from what I saw, that the big brands, the big marketing agencies, the big advertisers, they're actually not using the technology as much as they could because of the legal risk.
Yeah. No, and it's still an uncertain minefield to get into. You might say only the brave are going clearly deep into that. And I mean, the one thing, having seen some disruptive changes in multiple industries over the years, it usually is the smaller companies that tend to push, let's say, the regulatory or the legal envelope a little bit more than the larger companies. That's partly because the larger companies have a lot more downside to worry themselves about, and the smaller ones are really going for disruption and also that upside associated with growth. But equally, the regulators, in the case of regulatory risk, right, rather than legal risk, they're usually more willing to turn a bit of a blind eye towards smaller companies disrupting, because there's frankly less at stake. And you've seen that in for example, the crypto market, right? But to get back to your question, unless you can really say what are the risks, what's at stake here for my company, and there could be both, there's legal or regulatory or reputational issues. Equally, there could be things where AI could just destroy your business model, or kind of blow your company out of the water, right? And I've been some of the companies I've spoken to, for example, in the financial payments space. Now, I think it's true that fintech has not yet melted down the financial industry. Certainly in the Western world, you could argue very interesting trends in China and places like that, right? And some of the more emerging markets where you have less of an incumbency around the banking system. But there, some of the ability to enable, it's not just AI, but also digital and technology may create the ability to launch a product that is 10 to 100 times cheaper and 10 to 100 times better. And then how can you compete against something like that? So I'd say that that's also a life-changing or a kind of game-changing AI-enabled innovation. So yeah, it depends on the threat as to how deep you should get into it. I was reading this morning, and it was a very scary story about a vegan kind of health company that has basically poisoned its customers, and some of them have kind of got liver damage and lost their gallbladders by having some somewhat bizarre proteins from South America getting into their supposedly healthy vegan products. They handled it atrociously from a customer care aspect, but it just made me think, what can blow a company up, and if the leadership are not deep enough into what's happening. So be it like funny proteins in your shakes, be it probably some analyst putting some funny assumption around the mortgage default rate in some model that probably blew up around the time of the subprime crisis, or be it some AI risk in a company. There are these risks that are out there that can blow you up, that I guess if you're a leadership team or an executive and you don't know what those are, those can give you a nasty surprise. And of course, you can't know them all, right? But I think that's what your job is, to really get ahead of that and to educate yourself so that you can challenge your teams. Otherwise, you'll just be a passenger and not a driver or not a pilot of your ship, right? And therefore, I think as an executive, if you want to keep control over that, if it's important enough to have control over it, you have to understand it enough so you can actually exert control over it. And that, I think, is a level you have to get to. So you have to get a little bit dirty. But that doesn't mean you have to learn coding. But
I think that's the key. The word is enough, right? Like, I remember I've taken some courses that went into so much detail that it was just utterly pointless, and like, for me, very painful and utterly pointless. But there were others that essentially were much quicker and much more about, okay, you write some code and then you see a result very quickly, and then you can kind of just see how does a particular input create a particular output. That output is not going to be beautiful. It's not going to be particularly interesting. It might be like a little square. I remember I spent 3 hours changing the color of a black square into a little blue square. And I remember thinking, 3 hours of my life, like, why did I do this? And I would argue that was a bit too much, because they got us to do like too many things. But something, if you could basically, whittle that down even to an hour, where you could just see, okay, this is what an input looks like. This is what the output looks like. And this is, I remember I made some mistakes in the code, and I made a syntax error, and I didn't know what it was. And then, there was some bugs, and I was like, oh, finally, I understand what my developers are talking about. And finally, I understand that actually a bug is sometimes just a typo. And it's actually quite easy to solve, which made me, I think, much calmer when we had releases and stuff didn't go as planned. I then didn't think, oh my God, like everything needs to be ripped up and started again. I now knew that like somebody just needs to go and look at a particular line of code, and probably we can solve it quite quickly, which I think made me a better boss and a better collaborator to my tech team. And so now the latest trend in AI is generative AI. And so can you give us your take on what is the difference between standard AI and generative AI?
First of all, I would just say that from my perspective, generative AI is it's a continual transition. I know Sam Altman, in OpenAI, talks about this phase change that he's seen by the time the model gets to a certain scale. It certainly is able to mimic, reasoning capabilities. And if I think about the kind of intents that it's often able to capture, and I'll give you an example. If you type into Google, not to single Google out, but if you would Google what are the countries that are not Japan, or name the countries that are not Japan, you'll basically just find information about Japan, right? If you would ask ChatGPT at least 6 months ago when I was playing with it, because that was my first test, what are the countries that are not Japan? It will correctly understand your intent, right? That you're talking about countries that are not Japan. It will give you all list of the ones that are not Japan. So I think it's exciting to see, how those intents can be captured much more accurately than I've seen. It's exciting to see the speed at which, models can be built, and the speed. And I think we have so many unsolved problems in the world, right, that we need to solve as humanity, that anything that can help us solve that, I'd say bring that on. And I think generative AI can make a big contribution to that. But I would temper the comment, that comment was saying that we're still very much in the learning phase around it. And if I think about, let's say, your audience, or tech for non-techies, CEOs and executives, now we have to learn, and we really have to understand where's this going to have impact at scale. And I don't know everything that's going on in corporations around generative AI. I think there's some very interesting pilots that are going on. You mentioned some of the legal questions and challenges that people, I think, are rightly concerned with. But until we see the ability to ring the cash register in a material way for companies, especially given the current economic climate, the pendulum is swinging much more, away from growth towards value, right? So unless the value creation capability is there, we will still see dabbling and experimentation. Now, I'm a believer in it, so I'm hoping that we are going to see that. But that will be the proof that will take this beyond science experiments into real game-changing things that continue to change our lives in a positive way.
This reminds me of the discussion that we had when we met up in New York, which was, how do you tell hype from what's actually going to be meaningful change? Because yes, we've got this generative AI hype right now. Last year it was the metaverse, and to be honest, I wasn't really falling for it, because I always say, if you're hungry, you do not want a virtual burger. Like, that's not going to solve your problem. But I was, when there was the 3D printing hype, I kind of didn't really understand it, because I was thinking, can you really print a comfortable shoe? Like, I'm not sure about this. But I was thinking that maybe it's a thing. But essentially, there seems to be, very much like in the fashion industry, in the fashion industry, you have essentially a new look every season. I think in the tech industry, there's a new look every year. The cycles are a bit longer, but it's actually very cyclical in terms of the hype. And so, in your view, in general, how can you tell whether something is just hype, like 3D printing was, or whether it's going to be meaningful, lasting innovation that we should take account of?
No, that's a good question. And it's funny, I was just reading an article this morning on LinkedIn on my feed that was saying, generative AI saved Silicon Valley. Now, I think that's sort of somewhat of an exaggeration, I believe. But, if you looked at sort of where the tech bubble was going, where the valuations of the startups were going, that was very challenging, right? Last year. And all of a sudden now we have this kind of re-engagement around AI. As a company a few months ago that was valued at about $250 million, and it was only 4 weeks old. Right, so there's definitely some froth in the market. Let's just say that, and that's to be expected. There's always hype around it, and I think generative AI has been so engaging to the general populace, right? And we've all kind of been seduced by it, as I said earlier on. I think it's very understandable, but I guess one has to get down to the fundamentals. From my perspective, generative AI is really just a special case of AI. And AI is a special case of applying technology to business. And I think I always try to look at it at the same lens, which is, really rooted in this kind of impact and value focus. And the other day, a client asked me, he said, he's working in financial services, but he said, well, tell me the bank that's kind of applied AI the most. And, what they're getting out of it, right? And I'm not going to share any insider information here, but the bank that's talked about a lot the most in AI is JPMC, right? It's sort of the most valuable bank, one of the most successful banks or financial institutions in the planet. And if you can go back to their May investor relations presentation, and you can read all about this. It's all public, but they spend an enormous amount on technology. I think about 16 billion, and give or take, they've got about 43,000 engineers. So you could argue they're actually a tech company in their own right. They are the leading AI bank according to an external company rating. And so you think, well, what JPMC are getting out of AI ought to be a bellwether, for the impact you can get out of it, right? So their CIO, Laurie Beer, spoke about what they're doing, and they have several thousand people. I think it's between 2,000 and 3,000 data scientists, data engineers who are working on that. So that's fairly sizable, but a relatively small share of the total 43,000 engineers. And I think we're targeting about $1 billion, and now they're going to update that to 1.5 billion, impact of AI, and that's big money. But when you think about it, their trailing net income was about 50 billion for the last 12 months. So that's about 2 to 3% of their profit. So you think, okay, the world's biggest bank, and banking is really influenced by this, and the most AI savvy, and they're getting a 2 to 3% uplift on their profit. That's impact for sure, but that's and it's important, but that doesn't sound like it's game-changing impact, right?
But
so
do you expect it to
I think
grow?
that's
I mean, if it's going to be exponential growth, I mean, that again, I spend so much time with venture capitalists who basically are like, oh, it doesn't matter what's happening today. Look at the future. Is this the right approach here?
Well, I mean, you should definitely read Power Law, which is a great book to read on the venture capital industry. I read that last year. Now, so obviously exponential growth has underpinned many of the valuations in the industry. For some companies, it works out. For many, it does not. Obviously, venture capitalists take a portfolio approach to the world. But no, I like to look at real world companies like JPMC, and obviously, I'm probably making an attribution error here in terms of sort of the number of people working on this versus how data and analytics are having a broader impact at the bank. So obviously, I'm only basing on what's public, but what I've seen is that the average return on an AI initiative is usually below the cost of capital for a company, but increasing. And that's the average. And I think, the average belies like everything. It's like the person who's an average temperature of sort of 37 degrees centigrade, but their head is boiling and their feet are freezing, right? So clearly, I think what you're seeing is, and I've seen some individual AI programs that feel like they're akin to printing money, 10x or even 100x return on investments. So some very narrow, very focused AI is certainly impactful. The big tech companies, their business models couldn't exist without AI, right? So clearly, trillions of dollars of market capitalization has been created by not just AI, but AI has been a big component of that. And if I look at certainly the most successful AI startups, I think they're all, and I guess startups, you could argue by definition, have to be focused on a niche, but they are focused usually on quite specific, vertical domains.
Very narrow.
And what I'm finding about my work in the field is you really have to go down to a very specific problem and kind of really solve it for that. And obviously what these generational AI or these foundational models that underpin them, they are implying that we might be able to have more reusable, more leverageable components, because I think if we keep building everything in these small niches, we'll run out of data scientists to really be able to drive these unless we automate some of that data science. So I think that's a very interesting thing that will change or could change the business model around AI, right? Both for the benefit of companies implementing it, but also from the investor side. And that has to play out. That's basically playing out now. And I'm not sure which side I'm going to bet on yet, but it's really as Confucius once said, may you live in interesting times. I couldn't think of a better time to actually be in this field, but it's all playing out right in front of us now.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you, I'm Russian and I do not want to live in interesting times. I want to live in some times where that geopolitically it's really dull. But anyway, moving on. So this actually reminds me of the book Power in Prediction. And we've had the authors on here where they talk about system solutions and point solutions. And so essentially what they're saying is that right now we're at a time when AI is being used to solve a single problem very successfully. So it's a startup that has made a specific innovation that's making something easier, cheaper, possible, whatever. And that's just basically, kind of linking to a point. And what they say is that the AI revolution can only happen when the whole system changes. So rather than when you're just plugging in kind of random bits, which is still good, that's better than nothing, but it's not systemic change. Is that kind of what you're getting at too?
Yes, so I think there's two elements of the change, right? So there's an element, once we have all these point solutions, like just the cost to do each one and the time to do it, it just kind of really slows you down a lot. So systemically, we have to enable that, and some of these more foundational models, it's hope will actually help that. I think the other issue, though, and maybe that's where you're going, but this is exactly my kind of broadband provider experience, but I've seen it elsewhere, is we also have to think kind of end to end on, let's say, the processes, but equally how humans will interact with them. And I was working with a industrial company, and they had developed some rather whiz-bang algorithms to support their salespeople. And in essence, it was helping them. You've heard a lot about next product to buy recommenders and things like that. When you shop on Amazon, it'll give you like, here's the 3 things you should buy, right? So those have been around for 10, 15 years at least, I'm guessing, right? But they're not prevalent in all industries. And certainly when you get to sort of, more industrial type of products, they're less prevalent. And this company had a bright idea. They wanted to build an algorithm that would recommend the profit maximizing configuration for the products the salesperson would sell, based on everything they knew about the customer. It's a super idea.
Oh,
right?
sounds great. Yeah, I want that for my business.
It worked very well in sort of small scale pilots, but they really struggled to scale it out through their roughly, I'd say something like about 500,000, distributors and dealers that they work with, right? And there were 2 principal struggles. One is the sellers are incented on volume, not on profit, right? So they don't actually have an incentive, right?
Okay, but that's not AI's fault. That's basically, you can read Freakonomics, which is all about, okay, find the incentive,
right.
and then you uncover the crime, right?
Well, that's right. So one is the incentive issue. Second is I would say either the ego issue, but the fact that an algorithm knows your customer better than you gets to the essential ego of a salesperson, right? Now, and I agree with you, it's not AI's problem, but if you don't solve that problem, the AI doesn't have any impact, right? And ultimately, if the AI doesn't have any impact, the AI will unfortunately never thrive. So from that sort of systemic side, there's not only the systemic, how do I enable AI at scale and get away from a one-off each time, like a custom build each time I do it. And there's also how do I systemically enable that value pull through and capture the organization? So in my broadband example, I got the classic bouncing around. No one had the information or the empowerment to sort of try to solve my issue, and no one person could solve it. They had to get together to solve it, and they didn't. So if you don't solve that, it's as much an organization and management challenge as it is a technical challenge. That I think that's the point that I want to make.
Interesting. So basically, the human condition keeps on getting in the way of things. So we can have all of this technological progress, and yes, we're not there yet. There are still innovations that need to happen. Like generative AI keeps on hallucinating. It made up my bio, which was hilarious. So there is technological progress, that still has to move forward. But even when it does, we are still human. We still have egos. We still get offended if the AI is better than us, and we don't want to share the glory with our colleagues. And that fundamentally is probably an unsolvable problem, the human condition.
Probably unsolvable. It certainly seems to be a timeless, evergreen problem, and at least the most difficult one to solve, okay, if it will ever be solved. Yeah.
Well, that means that philosophy departments will never go out of business.